Fantasy baseball draft season is right around the corner, and this is probably the most important video I could take you through before you do your draft. You're probably gathering your draft lists, your sleepers and fades. You're probably watching videos on who breakout prospects or breakout players could be for this year. However, if you subscribe to this video, you know that I show you the math that I use to try to beat people in fantasy baseball, and I'm going to walk you through the data that I use to show you how I can almost guarantee that my fantasy baseball team will beat your fantasy baseball team just by looking at the numbers and the data. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to walk through this data and show you how this works. The first thing you need to know, one of the most important things, is what does an average player that's going to get drafted do? So in this case, I did an analysis of the top 150 hitters for last year, 2025. I ranked it by OPS and then checked out the data. Now, this probably fits pretty well to a 10 league team if you use a couple more positions, maybe 5 outfielders or some corner infielder or middle infielder positions, or a slightly deeper league, maybe a 12 team league where maybe you don't use as many of those extra positions and stick to some of the more normal ones. But the data holds pretty firmly around this. If you take a look at the data for the top 150 hitters for 2025, these are the average results that you got. So the average hitter, or the average results of the hitters in the top 150 who are likely to be drafted in your fantasy baseball league, deliver 77 runs a year, 22 home runs, 75 RBIs, about 12 and a half stolen bases, and depending whether you're in a batting average league or non-base percentage league, they bat 260, and the average on-base percentage is about 330. I did a little bit of rounding on some of those, take out any fractions, but you kind of get the big picture of this. So this is the average player that you can be drafting in your league. So the challenge is, to win your fantasy baseball league, we do not want to draft average players. We want to draft as many above average players as we can so that we rack up more stats and accumulate it faster than other teams. And this is true whether you're playing in a head-to-head league or if you're playing in a rotisserie league where you just need to figure out what's happening towards the end of the year. I'll talk to you about how this strategy I'm going to walk you through changes a little bit, depending whether you're in a head-to-head or a rotisserie league. But the most fundamental thing we need to do is to take this data and understand what are the results that the average player is going to get. So therefore, we draft someone really below average in something, we know they're hurting us, and we can draft somebody who delivers a little bit better value later. So I'm going to walk you through an example of a scoring system that I use, and I'm going to use one of my favorite undervalued players in Kyle Schwarber. Kyle Schwarber has been consistently delivering the last 4 or 5 years, especially the time he's been in Philadelphia, and he's been consistently underrated, especially to his contributions in rotisserie for a couple of reasons. One, because people think he doesn't contribute a whole lot in steals, and two, because he usually plays a DH or utility role. He no longer really plays outfielder defense because he was actually pretty terrible at that, even though he is overall a fantasy asset. So that's, most people treat him as a 4-category stud, but he can hurt you in batting average if you're in a batting average league. But let's walk through this because it's important to catch this before we go into and blow your mind with some other data when you stick towards the end to see how I put this together as I draft. However, you can see we just talked through with the average results for the top 150 hitters. And of course, Kyle Schwarber is one of the better hitters in baseball, so he out-delivered that. So he had 111 runs instead of 77, 56 home runs, 132 RBIs. So this shocked me. He actually had 10 stolen bases. So he was pretty close to the average stolen base player. I know so many people still a lot more, 30, 40, 50, but 10 is actually pretty decent for someone who hits so many home runs. Now, he does hurt you in batting average. He batted 240 last year when 260 was the average. But in on-base percentage leagues, he makes up for it, and he is above average. I think he gets a 365 last year versus a 330. So what I do is then I take a ratios of how many more stats does he accumulate than the average player. So for runs, 111 divided by 77 is 1.44. So on average, he's almost 1.5 average players worth for runs, right? 22 home runs are the average, so 44 would be twice as many home runs. So he actually delivers 2.5 home runs above the average person for last year. You can see where this is going. And then 1.77 RBIs, and surprisingly not too terrible, 0.8 stolen bases. Yes, his batting average was a little bit lower, 0.93 relative to an average guy, and his on-base percentage was 10% higher, so a 1.1 versus the average on-base percentage. So once you actually figure out these values, how much beyond the average player they are in each category, you can start to see where this is going to go. Then you can start to total that up and see how much value he is producing to accumulate stats for you over the year, whether it's in a rotisserie league for the entire year or head to head on what could happen week to week. And I split it here because most people are in a 5x5 league, whether it's an average, batting average, or on base percentage. And you can see when you sum that up, Kyle Schwarber accumulates 7.5 points. So if you are average in all these categories and you're in a 5x5 league choosing batting average or on base percentage, the average stats will get you a 1 in each of these. So you would produce 5 points. So the average player drafted is going to produce 5 points in a 5x5 league, and Kyle Schwarber is going to produce about 7.5. So he is about worth 1.5 average players, if you can see where this is going. Why I think he's still underrated for this is because if you look at the data, and I'll show you some of the data from last year, again, we're just looking at 2025 to kind of make this argument. Kyle Schwarber delivered that this 7.5 points, 7.67 in on-base percentage leagues, was the 10th best player value last year, and he's being drafted in the 3rd round, basically in 2026, depending on the size of your leagues. He's in the 20s being drafted. So this is where I think you can start to look at. It's not just, some people are looking at potential. Obviously, you can argue, is he really going to repeat this? Is he really going to hit 50? What if he drops to 40 home runs? There's so many things you can go through. However, that's why I'm just looking at, you can take whatever projections you like and apply this theory to it and figure out who's undervalued in your case and your scenarios based on projections that you trust. However, in this case, I'm just looking at 2025 data. It is undeniable that Kyle Schwarber was the 10th best value based on these metrics, even though he was drafted a little bit later than that in most cases, so he was a tremendous value in the league. So now when you plot this out and you look at it, you can see here of the top 400 or so players, I told you an average player in a 5x5 category rotisserie would score 5 points in the scoring system, and you can see here the top players in the league were near 9. So the top players in the league almost deliver twice as much value as the average player. They can accumulate twice as many stats as the average player. And Kyle Schwarber, being near around 7.5, was here in the top 10. He was actually number 10, and you can see the slope kind of declines here. So the goal to win your fantasy leagues is to draft as many players who contribute significantly higher on average in every category that you're drafting in, and avoid the players who actually start to hurt you or drag you down by scoring below average value in each of the categories. You can see where this is going. Obviously, you got to make sure you rebalance your teams, stack it properly, and stuff like that. So based on this, what I'm showing you here, you can see there are a few players who delivered almost twice as much value as an average player, 1.8 times an average player. So I'm going to ask you, based on what you know about what occurred in 2025, using this math and these statistics, which players had the highest player value for last year? And if you are starting to think between Aaron Judge and Shohei Ohtani, then both of you are wrong. And the player who actually delivered the most value using this format was actually Juan Soto. So a lot of people said maybe he had a kind of a down year, but a lot of his value you can see here is contributed to the fact that he had 3 times as many stolen bases average. He had 37 stolen bases. The average player is about 12.5. So that gave him a little bit leg up where he was, about half a point higher rated than Ohtani. And you can see Judge wasn't even number 3. It was actually Jose Ramirez, who I love, and I'll talk about in a second. I'm telling you that is someone who I think is also a potential sleeper in the first round. But you can see here, Juan Soto was 1.5 in runs, almost 2 in home runs, near 1.4 in RBIs, 3 in stolen bases, and then of course he's just slightly above average in both average and on base percentage, depending on what your league does. So now for next year, do I really think he's going to steal 37 bases again? Probably not. If you checked any projection charts that you may be trusting, that's probably not. Maybe they'll give him 20 or so, which may knock a point off. He'd still be 2 in stolen bases, so he might be near an 8 value, which might drop him right where you might think to have him for next year, maybe behind, in the mix behind Ohtani and maybe even Judge and so forth, right? So you can see how this is going, and you can look at it. That's why a lot of people who drafted Cal Raleigh won their leagues, because he was returned the 5th highest value on all these categories. And he was not drafted as the 5th highest player last year. This year, he's going to be drafted fairly high as well, but he delivered tremendous value because he almost had 3 times as many home runs as the average player. He did hurt you a bit in batting average, and you can see he did contribute a little bit better in on-base percentage leagues. So you can see where this is going. These are the top 2, 4, 6 players from last year based on this point system as to how they contributed overall. And the point is, when you're going through a draft is to accumulate as many positive points as you can above average, so that you can bank higher runs, higher home runs, higher RBIs, higher stolen bases than your competition, and then that batting average on base percentage without hurting any of those. And then if you're really tracking it carefully, you can even rebalance whether you're overdrafting in stolen bases or runs and home runs, which we'll talk in a little bit how that can become very important to making sure you don't follow this out the window. So now let's use this data to look at a second player who I think is actually, based on their 2025 performance, is quite undervalued. And that is Francisco Lindor. So Francisco Lindor from last year, if you look to do this points number and put it together for 2025, he returned the 8th highest value. PCA is also the 7th highest, so obviously with tons of stolen bases and so forth. But look at this. Francisco Lindor returned the 8th highest value last year using the scoring system, and he is currently being drafted 16th overall. He's not even the second shortstop to go. He's 4th among the shortstops this year, going behind Ellie De La Cruz, Gunnar Henderson, of course, Bobby Witt Jr. However, when you dig into the stats and you look at what they actually did last year, obviously you can look at your own projections and say how confident are you that they're actually going to produce what they did last year. But Bobby Witt Jr. was almost 7.7 points in a batting average league. Francisco Lindor was 7.6. So you only lost 0.1 points across all those categories if you waited instead of drafting Bobby Witt at number 3 and got Francisco Lindor at 16th. And I'm going to show you how we can stack this. And this is where I'm going to blow your mind of how I use this to balance out my team and guarantee I outperform your team across the board. But in on-base percentages leagues, it was basically identical. They're both worth 7.61 total category points, basically the same type of overall value. Now, it's not distributed perfectly uniformly, and that's something you're going to need to manage to make sure your team is balanced. But on the total value that they are contributing to your team above the average player, they were actually exactly the same as of last year. You can see here Schwarber again at number 10 with about 7.5 points on average, what we just talked through. All right. So now when we look at the total data and things from there, you can see why we get back here that here's again the top 6 that we had last year. But one thing I want to warn you about is because it's so relatively uneven, if you were to follow this strategy completely out the window, you can get yourself in trouble. So I devised this strategy about 15 years ago when I didn't know a whole lot about fantasy basketball, and I was actually in the head-to-head fantasy basketball league, and I actually used this to win my fantasy basketball league because Kobe Bryant, LeBron James, whoever the top guys were at the time, could only score twice as many points as the average player, and people were going for that. Whereas, guys like Dwight Howard were contributing 3 times as many rebounds as the average player and 5 times as many blocks as the average player, and sometimes 2 to 3 times as many steals. So you could stack those categories and have a better chance of winning. In baseball, it's the same way. Whereas you can stack some of these categories and bank excess value versus the average player so that you have a better chance of winning head-to-head or rotisserie leagues. But I'll tell you the trap of using this, if you were to truly follow this out the window, what generally will happen is you will generally overdraft stolen bases because you will just sort by the total points and you will likely draft tons and tons of stolen base guys, and you will have twice as many stolen bases as you may need. Let's say you only need 100 stolen bases to win your league for the year. You're going to draft 200 and you really got your team unbalanced, and you could have used that to get excess home runs, RBIs, whatever it is you're missing. So if you follow this out the window, you're likely to overdraft stolen bases too much, which is obviously important in the beginning of draft to get some of that and bank some stolen bases, but you don't want to follow it out the window. And however, what will also happen is if you follow this out the window is you will likely start to lose categories like average or on base percentage, because you can see most players are within a narrow band. The worst hitters, are maybe only 10-20% worse on average, so only cost you 0.2 of a point here. But in a head-to-head or even a rotisserie throughout the season, you can't end up being 10% down. And on average, it looks like it won't hurt you, but it will because you'll end up last in that category. So that's just some watch outs. It doesn't hurt you as much in a head-to-head league where you just have to win the majority of categories. But in a rotisserie league, it's much more important for you to be balanced. And that's why I actually check my teams as we go to make sure my team is more balanced and I'm not following this out the window and really punting one category. Generally, it's going to be batting average or on base percentage, because on paper, it's going to look like they hurt you the least, or it might be you overdo stolen bases and you got nothing but a stolen base team that can't hit a bunch of home runs, right? So now let's take a look at this for the draft. So if we were drafting again this year and using this type of strategy, and let's talk this through. Let's say if you watch my previous video on some of the sleepers and fades for this year in the drafts, you know there are some on this list that I personally selected for these reasons, just to make this an illustrative example. So let's say I drafted 2 picks behind you in this hypothetical draft. Now, don't tell me about snake drafts or anything like that. This is a hypothetical draft that I pick 2 behind you. So with their number 3 pick in the draft, you choose Bobby Witt Jr., and people would say in your league, fantastic choice. People will praise you. There's absolutely no harm in that pick. People say, oh, that's a great pick, and so forth. But if you saw my sleepers one, I actually said Jose Ramirez, who returned more value in 2025. So if he thinks he's going to repeat that data, I think he probably will. He has a good chance, obviously, because he's going to age at some point, but he could return much more value, right? Now we go to the second round where you've drafted Junior Caminero 2 picks ahead of me, and now he actually has some risk. So he's scoring lower points as of his last year data. He did hit twice as many home runs as the average player, and he wasn't too bad. A little bit hurt you in on-base percentage leagues. However, I really struggle to see if he's going to be able to duplicate these numbers as he goes and leaves a AAA or minor league ballpark and goes back to the Tropicana field. We talked about that in one of my other videos talking about the ballpark factor. If you want to go back and review that one, I also mentioned as in my sleeper and fades video on him. But here you can say, well, but I got some great position flexibility because I got, the number 1 shortstop and really the number 1 third baseman. So I'm on my way to winning this league, no problems. But you can see here, I actually did the opposite. I still got third baseman first, and I got a shortstop. So in the first 2 rounds, we both got a shortstop and a third baseman. So we're not really any positional flexibility differences between the 2, right? But I got Francisco Lindor, who we just talked about his numbers. And, again, this is looking backwards, so what's the odds that they reproduce their numbers? But if you go back and look at Francisco Lindor's numbers, he's been pretty consistent each of the last 2 years. So hopefully he can keep this up for 1 more year. Now we go to the third round, and you draft 2 picks ahead of me, and now you take Jackson Chourio, and you think you're having an amazing draft so far because you got the number 1 shortstop, the number 1 or number 2 third base in this case with Junior Caminero, and then you got Jackson Chourio, and your team's looking pretty solid. But in my third round, I take Kyle Schwarber, who we just talked about, 2 picks behind you. So on average, you can see here summing just the value of your picks based on where they're getting drafted right now. And FBC, your drafts your 38 across these rounds. I drafted 2 picks behind you, so my total value was 44, a little bit lower. And however, you can see here already the teams we're delivering, I'm crushing you in everything except for batting average. So you can see here in runs, I'm almost, I'm just under a whole point ahead of you in runs, which would be 77 runs ahead of you. In 3 rounds, I'm probably at least 50 runs ahead of you right now in projected runs scored. In home runs, I'm more than a point ahead of you, so I'm more than 20 home runs ahead of you at this point. It's a lot closer in RBIs, but I'm still ahead, and it's also, I'm up higher in stolen bases, so I'm about 1.5, so I'm probably 18 stolen bases ahead of you. Yes, you're beating me in batting average, but in on-base percentage, I'm 0.3 points ahead of you. So in the first 3 rounds of the draft, where I drafted behind you and gave you the choice of all the players that you wanted, and you took a lot of the trendy picks that I think that people probably wouldn't argue as you took these. People would say, oh, you're having a great draft. But if you go under the hood and use this analysis, what are the stats that you're actually banking towards your team? You can see here we both did a good job getting some stolen base players in the beginning, but overall I'm accumulating more stolen base stats than you, and on average I accumulated about 8 points higher. So I accumulated more than 1 extra average baseball player, almost 2 average baseball players in just the first 3 rounds. And that's why if we were in a head-to-head league, I would beat you up every single week. And even if we were in a rotisserie league, obviously everyone stays healthy and all that kind of stuff, I am leaps and bounds ahead of you in predicting most of these categories. And if I'm balancing this and tracking it going forward, I can then rebalance and make sure I try to get some batting average guys. So yes, I'm a little bit above average, so I might be in the middle of the pack of this league, but I'm so far ahead in every other category I'm making up for it, and I can find some batting average guys later in the draft that'll boost up this a little bit, and if they're more average in every other category. But this is the strategy where you actually take the numbers. This isn't about rankings, feelings, or projections, and so how people think who could break out. This is using the actual data from last last year and showing you that even though everybody has the data from last year, people would be choosing to draft Bobby Witt Jr., Junior Caminero, and Jackson Chourio ahead of Jose Ramirez, Francisco Lindor, and Kyle Schwarber, even with the data from last year. But the data from last year says that later drafted team is actually a much better team and produced better last year. So the only debate of whether or not I truly crush you or not is how confident are we that these players will be able to duplicate the results. And obviously this is a backward looking one to show you this effect and see you kind of nail it home. However, I do this for projection systems. So take any projection system that you like and then do the same calculation through the projection systems, and you're going to find a lot of inefficiencies and some really high valuable players that you can get relatively late in your drafts that are going to help you dominate your league. And this is how you take it to the next level, by knowing how much value you're drafting, and then you have to balance it across to make sure you get exactly what you need to finish in the top 3 of every category, especially in a rotisserie league, and don't overdo it or really punt any single category. So take this advice and use it and help dominate your leagues this year, and then make sure you watch one of these other videos because they say this is probably the next video that you would enjoy.